and good evening. It's September 28th, 2023, and welcome to another one of our Branches on the Vine with another one of the episodes from the wonderful folks at Aleph Beta with Rabbi David Fohrman. You know, I'm always interested in patterns, context, and connections. Go figure. You know, we're in this time of year that has been wrapped around some of the Moedim, the appointed times, these feasts of God. And I think maybe some of you wonder why they're even important. And do they matter? So Rabbi David Fohrman has an interesting video titled An Epic Understanding of the Jewish Holidays. In this video, we have patterns, context, and connections. So we're going to take a listen and then we're going to discuss. And welcome this evening to the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kind of podcasts useful, then click the subscribe button. The reminders are just there to help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click the like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So, an epic understanding of the Jewish holidays. So, let's take a listen and see maybe where we connect with this.
Hi everybody, this is Rabbi David Fohrman and you are watching Aleph Beta. Welcome to Parshat Emor. So I want to talk to you today about the Korban HaOmer, the Omer offering. Now the Omer offering shows up smack dab in the middle of what's known as Parshat HaMoedim, the section of text within this week's Parsha that lists the various holidays. And right in the middle of that, we're told about this offering called the Omer that's supposed to come from barley. And until that offering is brought, you aren't supposed to eat from the new harvest of that year. In Hebrew, that's known as Chadash. So what that means is that whatever grain is being harvested in the early part of the spring from the new year, you're not allowed to actually eat any of that grain until the Omer offering has been brought. Now, the question is, what exactly is this doing in the Parshat HaMoedim? Technically speaking, it doesn't really seem to be a holiday. It seems to be invading the Parshat HaMoedim. For that matter, there's another non-holiday event actually in the Parshat HaMoedim, and it's the laws of Leket and Peah. Now, these are the laws that dictate that you shouldn't reap all the wheat from the corners of your field. You should leave those for the poor, and if there's some gleanings that are left on the ground as you begin to harvest the wheat, so you should leave those for the poor also. So these are very nice laws, but they're not really attached to any particular moment of the calendar either, and they're not holidays. So what's Omer doing here, and what's the laws of Leket and Peah doing here? And for good measure, let me just throw in another question here about a technicality having to do with the Omer, which is when exactly is the Omer offering brought? It says that it's supposed to be brought Mimacharat HaShabbat, which literally means the day after the Sabbath. So the question, of course, is the day after which Sabbath? I mean, there's a lot of Sabbaths during the year. So this has led to the famous dispute between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So the Sadducees look at this and they say, well, you know, the last holiday we talked about right before the Omer was Passover. And then we hear that the day after the Sabbath, you're supposed to bring this Omer offering. So they think it means that whenever Passover begins, so you look at the Sabbath that happens after that, and then the Sunday after that Sabbath, that's when you bring the Omer offering. That would be the day after the Sabbath in the words of the text. So that seems to make perfectly reasonable sense, but that's not what the Pharisees say. Most modern Israelites living today were descendants of the Pharisees, and according to the Pharisees, the word Sabbath, as used in the text here, is actually a reference to the first day of Passover. So the day after the Sabbath means the day after the first day of Passover. And you know, that actually seems a little strange, because if the Bible wanted us to celebrate this on the first day after Passover, just say celebrate on the first day after Passover. Don't get all ambiguous on us and refer to the first day of Passover as Sabbath. What if the first day of Passover falls out on a Wednesday? So how do we understand the Pharisees' position here? How do we understand what the laws of Omer are doing here? How do we understand what the laws of Leket and Peah are doing here? I think that the key to answering all of these questions is actually locked up in an understanding of the Pharisees' position about calling the first day of Passover Sabbath. There's a reason you'd call the first day of Passover Sabbath, because it really is Sabbath. Let me take you back to an idea that I discussed last year in Parshat Emor and Parshat Bahar. If you look at Parshat HaMoedim, you will find two numbers recurring over and over again in the dates and the times, and those numbers are 1s and 7s. It almost seems like you're in this parallel universe where the only numbers there are 1s and 7s. You can look at the holidays and you'll see what I mean. Passover, it's in the first month. How long does it last for? For 7 days. Which days are holy? The first day is holy, the 7th day is holy. Then you're supposed to count 7 times 7 days, and then there's another holiday on the day after 7 times 7 days. And this just keeps on going. And as an explanation of this phenomenon, I suggested a theory that in effect, all of the Moedim are actually manifestations of the idea of Sabbath within the cycle of the year. The Sabbath itself is a holiday that recurs weekly, but perhaps there are other Sabbath events that occur during the year, and we call these the Moedim, the holidays. The very first of these is actually Passover. Sabbath involves a kind of rest from the creative process, and Passover also involves a kind of rest from the creative process. What kind of creative process? The process by which man creatively dominates the world of plants. To see it, let's talk about how you make bread. And here I'm reviewing a bit from last year. It begins with the planting of wheat. And wheat as a grain is lush and ripe and vibrant, but then you harvest the grain, which is really just a euphemism for cutting it down and killing it. But grain dies slowly because it's a plant. It needs to be deprived of water over time. You leave it out in the fields to die a slow death, and it gets to be brittle and crumbly, and then you take the wheat and you strip it away, and all you want is the seeds. The seeds which the wheat could use to reproduce itself, but you take those seeds and you smash them, destroying the wheat's last chance to be able to perpetuate itself, and you have flour. And then when you're good and done, because this process was a process of deprivation of water from the wheat, what do? Just when it's too late to actually help the wheat grow and recuperate anymore, you add water to the flour. And in so doing, you bring it back to life, because the flour and water, that mixture together, the dough actually becomes alive through the naturally occurring yeast that is on the side of the husks of wheat. Yeast is an organism, and when it comes into the bread, it lives. The CO2 that's exhaled by the yeast that causes the bread to rise. So just when the flour is dead, you bring it back to life again, only to kill it once more when you put the dough in the oven. As the baking bread gets warmer and warmer, the yeast becomes more and more active, rising even more until the temperature is too hot, killing the yeast. The yeast explodes into the bread, and you take the bread out of the oven, and now it becomes the staff of life for human beings. It keeps us alive now, but we have dominated the plants, exerted our creative control over them in making this bread. And acting like God, creating and dominating the world, molding it to suit our needs, always needs a time to stop, to pull back. The great teaching of Sabbath is that creativity cannot go on forever. It must be halted, otherwise it is a juggernaut that runs away with itself. God, the great creator in the sky, he rested, he stopped, and we stop too. We take a break from the process of bread making on Passover. It's our day of rest, with reference to the world of vegetation. And so there is a certain logic to the Pharisees' position that the first day of Passover is called Sabbath. It really is a Sabbath event. But here's a nagging question you might have when pondering this all. You might say to yourself, well, that's a very fine theory about Passover being Sabbath-like because we're taking a break from this kind of way that we dominate the plant world. But if you think about it, there's actually 2 cycles of life and death that we bring into the plant world in the process of bread making, and we're really only taking a break from one of them. You see, you can divide them up into the life and death cycle of planting the wheat, harvesting it, and killing it. And then the second life and death cycle is when you add water to the wheat and bring it back to life and then throw it into the oven and kill it again. Now, I get that on Passover, we take a break from the second one, but it's not really a Shabbos from the whole thing. What about the first part of the cycle? Where is the Sabbath event for that part of the domination of plant life involved in bread making? There is a Sabbath-like event for that part of the process, and it actually coincides with the Sabbath-like event for the other part of the process. What do you do on the day after this great Sabbath we've been talking about, this Passover event? you bring the Omer offering. But what does the Omer offering do? It allows you to eat from the new crop of grain. The grain that you planted, brought life to, and then you killed through harvesting. You can't touch that. You're in Sabbath mode with respect to that. All the way until the day after the first day of Passover, which means the first day of Passover is the one moment where you're actually resting from both parts of the bread-making cycle. You're not eating from the new wheat yet because you haven't brought the Omer, and you're not eating chametz. And that, I believe, is what the laws of the Omer are doing in these holidays. You see, the holidays, they're about Sabbath-like events. Paired with the Sabbath-like event of Passover is the Sabbath-like event of refraining from eating the new crop of wheat until the Omer is brought to allow you to have it. The Omer is about the larger Sabbath theme that these holidays is about, so of course it belongs here. And then you ask, why a few verses later do we have the laws of Leket and Peah? They might not be holidays, but what are they about? They're about resting from domination of the world of vegetation too. It's a different kind of rest. God says it's not just enough for you to rest with reference to me. This isn't just about me. You gotta rest with reference to your fellow man too. There's poor people out there, strangers who don't have land. Don't just content yourself in Passover with your abolition of chametz and think that you're done with resting from your domination of plants. Don't just bring your Omer offering and congratulate yourself on being able to eat the new crops. That same imperative to rest requires you to relinquish domination of your field of wheat and allow the poor and the stranger to reap nature's bounty as well. The bottom line is that man is given dominion over the world, and part of that includes dominion over plant life and vegetation. That power to dominate the world of plants is awesome in scope if that power has fueled the rise of human civilization. You can't have cities and towns unless you have a reliable source of food. If you're hunters and gatherers, you don't have the luxury of settling down and building a city or a town. You always have to move on to the next hunt. You only get to stay put if you can cultivate crops where you are. So our ability to dominate the world of plants is crucial to us. It's our creative prowess unleashed upon the world of vegetation. But that ability to cultivate and mold the world must have some boundaries. Some of those boundaries are designed to help you understand that there's people other than you that need to get fed. There are those who are lower than you, so to speak, on the socioeconomic ladder. But we also rest in deference to those who are higher than us, because we are only little creator. There is a big creator in the sky, the ultimate master in the universe. And rest teaches us that there are those below us and there are those above us, and both need to be acknowledged, but we cannot usurp that place. We cannot overshadow the poor, and we cannot overshadow God.
Okay, so maybe we can start off by addressing this. Me personally, I'm not compelled that the theological position that Jesus' death had removed the law. This is a great example of that. How would the death of Jesus negate the expression of the Omer offering and everything that surrounds it? Yeah, I mentioned Moedim, appointed times, feasts, holidays, as it were. A time where we take time out to acknowledge God in some unique way. They reflect the interactions with God and man, and specifically with the children of Israel. Echoes of Messiah intertwined. But it seems even then that those connections, there's those repeated patterns, that they take us back to the garden and creation. That's everyone's beginning. So Rabbi Fohrman, he started by addressing the Omer offering. Rabbi Fohrman constantly reminds me to examine context. And that context can also include the physical placement in Scripture. Look where we are, why are we here, and see what is around. In the middle of it, as it were, these description of these wonderful feasts, we are dropped into this Omer offering. The placement might seem odd, and it, as I see it, it tells me to sit up and pay attention. You know, you might want to try this with some of the gospel accounts as well. You might find it interesting why the storytellers, the authors, put those stories together in that order. Those stories together. Because each author did it a bit differently. You might find some interesting things. So this offering, it sits here in the in-between. So we look for connections. I often call them red strings. Then, after that, we have the instruction on how to reap your fields, as in what to do and what not to do. Don't reap all of it. Leave some for a purpose, a greater community purpose. It's to serve both the local needy, the sojourner, the traveler. So maybe it's not even one of your own. So why are these two events, these instructions, interjected in this account at this time? What are we maybe supposed to pay attention to? We get this Omer offering instruction with some timing issues, right? Okay, and I'm going to fully admit that it was probably very clear to the original audience, right? They got it, they understood. But through thousands of years, the diaspora, with the stories that followed, this timing has now come up for debate. I am not here to take a position on which Sabbath one uses to count. I truly have friends that are on both sides of this. I'm very comfortable letting them live out their choices. So don't get hung up on the choice. Let's focus on the practice. So how did you see the ones and sevens? How did they hit you? Those numbers intertwined again and again, because they seem important to God. So again, I'm not compelled by the position that these were tossed away. These don't apply. Because something so intricately woven by God, I think we need to take the time to explore, to find out, and to capture. And of course, I even like that the Sabbath is the first of its kind on the seventh day. Of course, all of this is tied back to creation, to the beginning, to our roots as the beings that we were created to be. I really enjoyed the bread connection, the red string of the cycles of life and death, and the ties to its purpose and community. And when we step away from that cycle for a Moedim, we acknowledge God in those very moments. One of the things that challenges me when I jump into things like the bread thoughts is, what might or how might those living in the moment, those living forward, right? How might they have seen it? These, the Midrash thoughts are years old, some a few thousand, some a few hundred, and some much newer. But for instance, the bread rising. We know it now to be caused by CO2 being released by activated yeast. But did they even have a concept of live yeast or bread breathing? Or did they just know through experience that this is what happened? And that drove how they lived it out. So then the need to remove the old starter breads that they had in their homes so that each year this was performed at Passover to remind them of all of that. And then for us to see it in their practice. We seem to know, we seem to understand how and now, but then they just obeyed. So maybe if you look at the Passover and the last days with Jesus and the disciples, maybe we can see it there too. That Sabbath rest reminder, that time to remember so much more that's in that Moedim, that feast day. Oh, and did you catch that Passover is the first feast? It's the Moedim. First month. You might want to chew on that a bit. So the Omer offering, the sacrifice for the end of the harvest, the gift of the harvest. Now we can fully eat. Now we can fully experience the abundance of the harvest. There's been sowing the field, reaping the harvest, leaving some for others. But wait, we needed the Passover to take us into the future. These feast days and the events that are deeply intertwined, the moments taken to stop, look, pay attention, look outside yourself, and to acknowledge where it all came from. The days we are in now, just after the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement, Sukkot is approaching. It's a very good time to stop, look, and listen, and maybe see if our creativeness and boundaries, they align with God. Do we even consider those ones and sevens? I loved where Rabbi, where he closed. There are those above us, and there are those below us. They need to be acknowledged. We cannot usurp the place above, and we cannot overshadow those below. And we can never overshadow God and His creation. Again, Sukkot's just around the corner. A feast where we really do acknowledge that one above, the provision and protection of God during a most important and vulnerable time to begin this journey and for us to continue. A friend of mine, he sent me a verse. Thank you, Redeem. And I should not be surprised, really, that it connects here, right? It's Philippians 4:9. Practice what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and model your way of living on it. And the God of peace will be with you. So thank you for being with us tonight on another edition of The Dusty Feet.